Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Daniela Fuchs will defend the academic thesis, Unlocking Participation, the Dynamics of Opening Up and Closing Down in Emerging Technologies. May I please invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Highly esteemed prorector, dear Corona members, dear family, dear friends who are all watching online, welcome. Thank you for this opportunity to present my dissertation, Unlocking Participation, the Dynamics of Opening Up and Closing Down in Emerging Technologies. Science, visions of desirable futures are based on societal values, and science and technology are usually part of these visions. Yet they have been criticized for not sufficiently considering societal objectives like sustainability or responsibility. To ensure safe, just, democratic, and socially robust decisions, science, technology, and innovation governance, what I will call STI governance from now on, aims at including a broad range of societal voices in decision-making. Especially new and emerging technologies like nanotechnologies, synthetic biology, or artificial intelligence evoke great expectations and fears. To overcome these ambiguities, STI governance brings different actors into dialogue with each other. This should ensure reflection on emerging technologies, better align them with societal values, address and counter democratic deficits in technology development, and foster innovation. Thus, engagement should empower stakeholders and the public to raise their voices and strengthen their agency. STI governance tries to open the question of engagement, but how to do this is still a challenge. In my dissertation, I seek to contribute to this challenge by analyzing what it means for STI governance to open up or close down in an empirical way. To me, participation and societal engagement are like a door. They structure metaphorical space by granting or denying access, just like agency in STI governance is enabled or constrained to varying degrees. In my research, I'm interested in the dynamics and mutual dependencies between opening up and closing down. Therefore, as you can see here, my research question was, how do opening up and closing down appear in different settings of science, technology, and innovation governance? I was inspired by Andy Sterling's work in which he describes the notions of opening up and closing down to conceptualize the contradicting forces of participation and societal engagement in STI governance. For him, participation complements scientific analysis. Both generate knowledge for decision-making. They are equivalent, yet functionally different. In considering both, opening up and closing down emphasize the conditions of STI governance. To learn more, I disentangled different dimensions of opening up and closing down in my dissertation. I looked at the social, at the epistemic, at the normative dimensions by investigating and studying the actors, the knowledge and issues, the values and norms in different settings of STI governance. Hence, I looked at opening up and closing down as a language and a starting point to analyze the challenges for meaningful and robust societal engagement. I understand opening up and closing down as empirical phenomena and traced how they enable or constrain agency. In short, I examined when and how opening up occurs in STI governance and when societal engagement closes down STI governance. To follow opening up and closing down in different settings of STI governance, I selected 3 case studies, as you can see here. Each of them builds on different data. Besides analyzing literature and documents, I conducted and analyzed focus groups for the first and interviews for the other 2 case studies. Also, these case studies differ in the characteristics of discourse they describe. They analyze stories, debates, and computer software. The first case study examines attempts of opening up the formation of technology myth as public sense-making in the context of neuroenhancement. It emphasizes the performative power of stories. It assumes that expectations are like myth. Since secure knowledge is scarce early in technology development, different actors interpret neuroenhancement in various ways. Here, I was interested in how technology myths transfer meaning and values between different technologies. The second case study opens up the engagement of civil society organizations in dialogues. It examines how civil society organizations engage in the debate on synthetic biology and investigates how different forms of engagement contribute to opening up or closing down. To do so, it focuses on the interrelations between the actors involved, the formats, and the framings of the respective settings. The third case study opens up computer modeling in the context of nanorisk governance. It shows how a specific software affords shifts in ideas on how to assess risks, govern emerging technologies, and design relations between science and policymaking. To do so, it looks at stakeholder engagement and expertise, at concepts and normative assumptions at the core of the software. To provide you with a glimpse on my empirical work, I will present the main messages of each case study. As you will see, the picture of opening up and closing down is variable and dynamic, just like the possible states of the metaphorical door I spoke of earlier. To analyze public sense-making in neuroenhancement, I looked at the performative powers of stories for opening up and closing down. Involving the public opened the overall debate on neuroenhancement by introducing a broad range of technology myth. Yet, myth emphasize specific characteristics of a technology according to the overarching perspective. In so doing, they close down interpretations and, by extension, possible future of technologies. Thus, on one hand, involving the public opens up the discourse as it introduces a broader range of interpretations. At the same time, however, these stories tend to colonize future of the specific technology and might close down debates. To analyze debates on synthetic biology, I looked at how different actors entered into dialogue. Civil society organizations drove public protests against synthetic biology, but other forms of engagement also involved actors from science, industry, and research funding. By focusing on risks, the debate was originally closed down. Yet civil society organizations opened it up by raising new issues, such as global fairness, and this allowed to renegotiate broader issues, such as sustainability. However, debates tended to close down when actors refused to balance their positions against the positions of others. In particular, dialogues in decision-making settings, be it industry or policy, ran into risks of being pre-framed and closed down. Consequently, civil society organizations refused to contribute and to participate. To summarize, involving actors like civil society organizations can open up debate, but to ensure the participation, we need diverse engagement formats and framings to provide space for renegotiating issues. To analyze software for modeling risk governance in the context of nanotechnology, I looked at affordances. Again, the debate was opened up by involving a broad range of actors and perspectives, and this resulted in conceptual shifts of the software. However, due to its complexity, the target groups of the software remained quite narrow. Also, the software overall adhered to conveyed understandings of risk assessment and regulatory requirements, which limited the space for opening up. In addition, whether it was considered a scientific endeavor or an industrial application defined the importance of opening up itself. From a scientific perspective, opening up was more important than for application in industry. In any case, the software allowed for opening up debates on risk governance in nanotechnology altogether. In short, scope and purpose limit the applicability of software, and additional functionalities may open up how risks are discussed in wider society. My core research interests were the dynamics between opening up and closing down in different SDI settings of emerging technologies. In short, how an agency is enabled or constrained in each case. To do so, as I mentioned before, I disentangled the social, the epistemic, and the normative dimension in each case study. What did I learn? Distinguishing these three dimensions shows that they do not open or close in the same way. For example, in STI governance, the social dimension is often considered crucial for opening up or closing down. The question of who is included in a specific setting is omnipresent. Yet, I found that other dimensions affect the tendency to open up or close down even more. Also, the conditions of the case studies affected how each dimension manifested. For instance, I found the epistemic dimension, issues and knowledge to be highly contingent on the case study's position in the innovation stream. This affects how issues manifest and which knowledge is available. Moreover, my case studies showed that the epistemic dimension is often combined with the normative as framing. In so doing, I confirm Sterling's finding that framing orients debates as well as provides information. By disentangling the social, epistemic, and normative dimensions, I fine-tuned this finding and discovered that values and norms are most crucial for defining actors and as well as knowledge in the respective case. I learned that the normative cannot be closed down completely. It remains negotiable, at least in principle, and this holds interesting implications for societal dialogue altogether. Conveying lessons learned between case studies is challenging, and in my cases showed that opening up and closing down remained fragmented and incomplete. Regarding the questions how participation enables or constrains agency, however, two lessons stand out. The first one is that the proximity to decision-making defines the scope of agency. The closer to decision-making, the more restricted its scope, the more concrete or closed down engagement settings are, the fewer framings deem valid. At the same time, the impact of participation and societal engagement increases downstream, where settings tend to close down. Actors then tend to have a more articulate view on how they are affected, which again defines how they would like to engage. This results in different preferences for engagement in STI governance. A systemic perspective on participation and societal engagement can help to identify overarching tendencies of opening up and closing down. The second lesson is that the normative dimension dominates the other two. The framing of an issue relies on knowledge and values, but it is ultimately the normative dimension that defines the openness of debates. Earlier studies have shown that the normative dimension cannot be closed down completely because there is simply no right or wrong to ethical questions. Therefore, normative conflicts remain unresolvable. Consequently, if closing down is impossible, opening up and closing down are temporary rather than final outcomes of STI governance processes. In STI governance, complete closure may even be undesirable. It would simply risk missing innovation opportunities. With this, I would like to come to the end of my presentation today. I pushed the metaphorical door open, a little bit at least, to provide a glimpse on my PhD work. My PhD made me realize that they structure metaphorical space. Participation and societal engagement provide a frame for STI activities, grant or deny access to actors, and actively shape STI governance. At the same time, they are variable and dynamic. Access remains a matter of gradation, as a door can be locked, opened wide, or just ajar. Accordingly, how participation and societal engagement are constituted varies just like agency is enabled or constrained. Thank you. I would like to give back the word to the prorector. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation, and the opposition will now be opened by Professor Annick Hommels, Professor of Socio-Historical Technology Studies at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidates, I would like to start by congratulating you on completing your dissertation. I really enjoyed reading it. It's well written and well researched. You do a good job bringing the 3 cases in connection with the conceptual framework of opening up and closing down, and you draw some interesting conclusions from this. The thesis prepares the grounds for the empirical case studies well and succeeds also in providing an overarching analysis across the cases, comparison and reflection in the last 2 chapters, 8 and 9. The conclusions engage well with the existing academic literature on the topic, and you also make a contribution to this literature, I think. I also appreciate your focus on the structures that enable as well as constrain agency in the governance of new and emerging technologies, and your attempt to move away from this linear understanding of public engagement as a matter of timing. My question relates to the last slide, I think, that you presented, the mechanisms of closing down and the normative dimension. You paid quite some attention to that in your presentation and also in your thesis and your conclusions, because you argue that the normative dimension always dominates in discussions about the appraisal of new technologies, and that compared to the social and epistemic dimensions, the normative dimension is the most crucial for the dynamics of opening up and closing down. You also say that the normative dimension can never be closed down definitively, because typically normative and ethical issues are harder to find agreement upon. As you just said a few minutes ago, there's no right and wrong answers to ethical questions. And you also quote Sterling, 2008, who argues that this inability to reach closure is not problematic. And that reaching closure is also not necessary for decision making, and also reaching closure can be undesirable even, with the eye on potential for innovation. So I fully acknowledge the idea that closure is often only temporary and that it would be undesirable to close debates too soon or forever. However, I also feel that this reasoning needs some further elaboration and clarification, especially regarding the consequences of this. So I would like to take this opportunity to explore the implications of the persistent open-endedness in normative discussions a little bit further together with you. Mm-hmm. And I have a few questions related to this. And the first is, what, in your view, are the potential advantages and disadvantages of the normative dimension dominating discussions about the appraisal of new technologies, and then particularly in this context of closing down processes? So the advantages and disadvantages of this dominance. And secondly, I think that's maybe the more important question, considering the challenges that are posed by the dominance of this normative dimension and the impossibility of reaching closure on those aspects forever, what do you see as the most promising approaches or strategies for the governance of new technologies?
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for these questions and for giving me the opportunity to elaborating a little bit more on this. The advantages and disadvantages of this normative mention. I think the advantages or the disadvantages, let's start with that, is that societal dialogue in any kind of way needs endless patience altogether, not necessarily from one person at a time, not necessarily at one instance, but altogether if this is, if moving forward, if innovation is to be done in a pluralist way, in a way in a democratic setting, it means that you have to acknowledge other perspectives, and this might require both time, resources, and all kinds of other resources from personal as well as monetary. I think the advantages, The advantages of this normative openness or one of the advantages is maybe the possibility to actually be able to stir development in any kind of direction at any moment in time, even if in the meantime decisions have been made, right? So the discussion very often is the Collingridge dilemma. I have it in my thesis as well, that the opportunity of intervention decreases with a long time. The open-endedness of at least the normative dimension would actually argue against this, would say that, of course, there would be enormous efforts maybe, but it's always possible to actually steer it in one or the other direction. So keep going in any kind of different way and to address the remaining issues that are still there. I think that's one of the main advantages. The second question, if I recall correctly, is about the implications for governance, right? So if the challenge is this kind of patience, it would be on a political and a governance side, would be to have patience with the outcomes and the impacts of these kinds of endeavors. It's a call that has been made for, decades now, that impact is very difficult to measure, in particular when it's about participation. Certain ways, so there is, impact is always a question, but it also means that it also means that these attempts need to be taken seriously, not in an instrumental way, not being set up for failure because of shortages of diverse, practical issues, but to be taken seriously. I think that's the two implications for governance in a very concrete sense. I hope that's the level you addressed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Michael Decker, Professor of Technology Assessment at the University of Karlsruhe Institute of Technology.
Dear candidate, congratulations to this great work and presentation today. I especially liked your analysis of this matrix structure of three dimensions, three technologies, and I especially thought that you choose them in a very sensitive or sensible way, so to say, because neuro enhancement pretty close to the body, where we usually find that participation works better anyway, so to say, and synthetic biology between the middle, so to say, and nanotechnology, which is probably the most surprising technology with regard to participation, as it is very chemical, physical, and not very touchy at all, so to say. So this brings me to the question that participation in new and emerging technologies, they don't go very well hand in hand, so to say, because if you take it from a technology assessment perspective, you would always argue, okay, new technologies, there's not much knowledge around there. Doesn't matter if it's in citizens or at stakeholders. In the stakeholder situation, you usually call in their positions in the public debate anyway. So therefore, I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit on how this participatory approaches worked out in these new and emerging technologies, and maybe with the idea to give some recommendation how you handle them and how the three cases also brought up different findings there.
Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for giving me the opportunity to answer this question. It is quite a stretch between, you're completely right, between neuroenhancement and nanotechnology in all kinds of ways. And you're also correct that participation and societal engagement usually work better when, well, the issues at stake are more tangible and when there are actual interests at stake for some people. When we did the case study, for example, on neuroenhancement, that was at a time when the discourse on, or the public debate on neuroenhancement was not very well established yet. We did a media analysis in the project I worked on. So we had to do a lot of reflection on what we were actually doing there, because at one hand, we tried to, well, assess a technology that was not even there, not completely. On the other hand, it could have been there because there was interest in maybe trying to find ways to govern these kinds of technologies. So I would argue that it's striking a balance between stirring a debate on your own by introducing these kinds of terms, these kinds of technology into the public sphere, or strengthen them in the public debate. At the same time, and that's what I think my case study shows, it was less about the technological part of neuroenhancement in this case, rather than the question of what people would make out of it, like in what kind of direction they would be triggered to think when they think about neuroenhancement, what kind of fear this would evoke, and what kind of hopes also. We had a kind of quite a bit of hopes there, especially in our classrooms with our students. So yes, that was, I agree. The second part of the question I would ask you to rephrase, if that's okay.
Yeah, so maybe you can elaborate a bit on the nanotechnology case, where I found it a bit more tricky, so to say. And I can remember the first moves on nanotechnology, which was actually politically introduced by Bill Clinton several decades ago, and it was a totally different term when it came to societal debate. So.
Yeah, in my case, like in my case study on nanotechnology, the perception of public moved from the broader public, what we had in the lay public, what we had in neuroenhancement, towards more stakeholder-induced public. So you had stakeholders also for the public to a certain degree, people who felt responsible for introducing ideas of responsible innovation, for example, to make sure that civil society organizations could be heard. But on a practical level, what we found in these interviews was that most of these public actors actually would not like to participate in the end, because the framings would not be to their liking, would not cover their perspectives. Okay? The discourse was actually moved, or the debate was actually moved. Like the broader public debate would have been moved somewhere in, I don't know, the OECD, for example. So different fora, different ways of elaborating pros and cons, risks, ethical issues, rather than doing this in this particular project that we looked at. Okay.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Cornelia Conrad, Associate Professor of Anticipation and Assessment of Emerging Technologies at the University of Twente.
Yeah, dear candidate, I would also like to congratulate you on the thesis, which I read with great interest, and that I think manages to, on the one hand, draw on very rich empirical material, and at the same time make a valuable contribution to a long-standing conceptual debate about opening and closure processes around technology development. In principle, one could say contributing to a long-standing debate, great salience, but also may make it more difficult to provide an original lens, original results, but I think you manage very well to provide such an original lens with considering these different dimensions of opening up and closing down and their interdependencies. This being said, there remain some questions, both on what you have discussed in your thesis and also what I think you have not. We'll see how much we can discuss here. Maybe to start with a set of puzzles which are related to your study, your first study on the role of myths and analogies in making sense of early emerging technologies. assuming, and later in the chapter it becomes clear that this is also your assumption, I think you also mentioned it now in the presentation, that there's not really a way of making sense of novel technologies without drawing on analogies, on comparisons with former technologies or whatever. I wonder a little bit why the focus on this chapter is so strongly on the role of TA as debunking or busting myths, as people might say, deconstructing myths, whereas fostering, let's say, a constructive approach to mobilizing myths, more as a resource, I would call it, is mentioned as an important role also towards the end of your chapter. But I think it remains a little bit blurry or underrepresented. So I was wondering if in the meantime, I mean, the chapter has been out for a couple of years now, you maybe have developed this constructive role of using these analogies, myths, a little bit further? Or would you say that I'm wrong and it actually is more a problem than a resource? Related to this, could you maybe explain why you decided to draw on Roland Barthes' concept of myths? Because to my understanding, I think if for this point on how one relates to existing concepts, analogies, to make sense of novel things, well, there are various theories who do similar stuff. In the past I've worked with rather concepts of Schütz or Piaget on schemes and so forth, which to my mind would maybe lend themselves a little bit more also seeing this more creative role here, being a bit less biased to this normative connotation of myth. Doesn't sound very positive in a... yeah, but there's probably a reason you chose for this, so if you can elaborate on this a little bit, would also be nice.
Thank you very much, esteemed opponent. I think it's you made a very important point, the constructive role of TA or in deconstructing myth or constructing myth, and our critical stance towards our own role in pushing this, this term also of neuroenhancement and this concept a little bit further. Our critical stance at that point of time came out of this, feelings may be the wrong word, but the idea that neuroenhancement was very much, that the term neuroenhancement was very much brought on us by the European Commission as a possibility to elaborate on emerging technologies. There were two sister projects. One was Synergy and on synthetic biology. The other one was on neuroenhancement, was NERI at that time. So, and we felt a little bit that this synthetic biology may be a little bit less, but neuroenhancement at the time showed nowhere, basically not entirely, and through cascading these engagement activities, it was a project that was mainly oriented towards broad ways of engaging and doing as many engagement events as possible, for example. We felt a little bit that we would push this idea of neuroenhancement, this idea of maybe misuse of medication, maybe application of new devices, maybe research for new substances, a little bit too much. So that's why we had this very critical stance towards our own role at the point of time when we discussed in our focus groups with our schools. People had never heard of the concepts of neuroenhancement before, so that was simply a non-issue. That they made more sense of, pressure at work, pressure in school, things like that. So all the daily experiences all around, but not necessarily neuroenhancement as a concept, the way we emphasized it.
I was less seeing now TA per se as a maybe not so constructive, but more in the sense if making these analogies cannot also be a constructive resource. So whereas here it seemed to be more as, well, this more closing down role, while one could also say, there's probably no way to make sense of anything without, somehow.
Oh, yeah. I agree there. So there is always a way, you always have to draw on familiar concepts, right, to make sense of something you have not explored. I totally agree there. I think it's a constructive approach. I just think you have to be aware and you have to reflect on what you're buying, basically with your analogy, and what ideas of how life is, or you think life is constructed around you, by using these analogies. Yeah, to reflect on that a bit more. So what is covered basically behind these terms? Would a neuroenhancement, in our case, was like drinking coffee or like taking drugs? You had the whole field of daily activities you could do with it, you could use it for. So you just have to be aware on what kind of ideas basically you follow or you reflect on it. Is that more? Would that cover the direction of your question? Okay. Yeah. The second part was on Roland Barthes and the question why we chose Roland Barthes. You are totally aware there are 1,000 different concepts on this issue. We just, for that, at that point of time, we found it an interesting concept. We just liked it and thought we'd give it a try where to go. So it was more, came out of a kind of playful approach to Roland Barthes per se, and to see whether we could actually use his concept in any kind of TA setting. It was not necessarily a screening process on how to, on different concepts, but it was more like we would like to see where this is going. So I would never defend Roland Barthes and his approaches against any others, but I think it was an interesting way of, an interesting experience. And in my thesis, it strengthened a bit more the focus on the linguistic part. So the perception of stories, to have it there as a totally, like an idea of the performative part of stories, basically, put the emphasis there. That's where Roland Barthes, I think, fits quite well in my overall thesis.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Cyrus Modi, Professor in the History of Science, Technology and Innovation at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Maastricht.
Dear candidate, let me offer you my congratulations on this very well-researched dissertation, and my thanks for the opportunity to read it and to engage with this important argument, intervention really, that opening up is a double-edged sword, that it has consequences in many different directions, and continual opening up is not always the answer. I found this to be a very textured and engaging study of societal engagement in science, technology, and innovation governance, both as if from the outside, as an analyst's picture of this community and its approaches, but also informed by, and all the more impressive for, also coming from the inside, a study conducted as you were engaged in many of the practices that you tell us about in the dissertation. I was, as you might imagine, most engaged by the chapter on nanomaterials and risk, having studied that field for quite a long time. And unlike my esteemed colleague, I didn't find that to be surprising, in the sense that nanotechnology is not at all something that's distant from us. Everyone in this room is carrying nanomaterials-enabled technology with them at this very moment. So I wanted to ask about the industry that gives us nanomaterials in this form, namely the semiconductor industry. This is an industry that, by any working definition of nanotechnology, has been manufacturing nanomaterials for at least 20 years. It's, I would think, probably the largest nanomaterials industry. It's also a globally controversial industry and has been for a very long time around its labor practices, especially regarding women and people of color, its environmental practices, its occupational safety, and now currently for its the pressures that it exerts on global diplomatic relations. Here in the Netherlands, of course, nanomanufacturing is at the center of tensions between the Dutch government and both the People's Republic of China and the United States. Mm. And yet, for all of the vast literature on societal engagement and anticipation of risks of nanomaterials, those kinds of issues are almost always outside the bounds of debate and discussion. So let me ask you, what would it mean for those issues to enter into discussions of societal engagement around nanomaterials, and why is it that they are usually outside the scope? Is this merely a matter of opening up? Could it perhaps be a matter of linking, that this industry is not seen as nano, but if it were linked in, then the discussion would look very different? Mm-hmm. Is it perhaps a matter of temporality, that those discussions are always about the future, anticipating risks, rather than about matters that are currently controversial? So yes, I would be very interested to hear your take on these various matters.
Right. Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent. Unfortunately, I have nothing on this in my thesis, but I do have an opinion, and I have been working with nanomaterial as well. I think it's a double-edged sword, right? It's about where do I draw the lines in my system, and these kinds of questions are usually unpleasant that they're very likely to be pushed outside these boundaries. And it's very easy because we do have a very specific idea on what kind of nanomaterials, on how we deal with nanomaterials, and how the governance system works on nanomaterials. It could work mostly adhering, at least in my experience, very much on chemical industry and adopting REACH, for example, in very many cases. So there is a specific framing that these governance activities draw upon. And looking at this particular aspect on this particular software I looked at, like this engagement, this tool, you can find these framings very easily. You very easily see that the broader discussions on nanomaterials, they are put wherever in any other kinds of broader fora at the OECD level on one hand when it comes to testing, but also in different other social fora. And these kinds of tools usually then work just as a boundary object, but only between different or specific actors that are very well established in this discourse already. So including the second part, and that's the interesting one, because I said there were two parts, right? That would be the linking that you mentioned, to be linked to the issue of nanotechnology as a nanomaterial. And we see that for quite a while now, that there have been materials have been redefined as nanomaterials, but the research processes behind it, they don't change, right? They don't care whether it's nanomaterials or not. Sometimes there are impacts of these kinds of definitions on how things are governed. For most of the parts, there's none, or there are hardly any. So I do think it's this combination of pushing the boundaries and establishing certain links rather than others that keeps these discussions at bay. Although I think they, in terms of material, use of materials, use of resources, these kinds of questions tend to come back in certain ways through the back doors, right? Also with the certain regulations you have there trying to be established, at least right now. To some extent. You?
Short follow-up, yeah. So So I think I see what you're saying, and I agree to some extent that it's all about the framings that are pushing these discussions in a direction defined by regulatory frameworks and by international organizations such as OECD. But can you maybe address the temporality question? Is societal engagement is its ability to do anything in the world hindered by its focus on the future and on anticipation and its lack of engagement with the things as they are?
I don't think that's necessarily true, right? The engagement is not necessarily focused on anticipation. I mean, the examples in my book are, or at least the neuroenhancement example, they are to a certain extent. But when you look at CSOs who are engaging in debates on diversity, biodiversity, for example, in my synthetic biology chapter, or who have been engaging in the discussions on nanomaterials in both regulatory contexts as well as coming from the outside, trying to push their agendas, I don't think that necessarily that participation and societal engagement necessarily focuses on the future per se. I think it's more a question of having the right timing to actually move things in the right direction. Would this be? Yeah.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Danny Shanley, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and History of Technology, also at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
Dear candidates, dear Daniela, first of all, let me begin by adding to the chorus of compliments. I really took great pleasure in reading your thesis, and I must say I really admire the way that you put it together. Despite drawing upon a number of different projects, as we've heard, and different forms of participation, you managed to successfully organize your thesis in both a clear and convincing way. You guide the reader attentively through the ways in which engagement practices serve to both open up and close down our ways of thinking about the possible trajectories of new and emerging technologies, as well as the debates and negotiations which these ways of thinking can enable or constrain. I can quite imagine that there must have been many moments when corralling all of this into a coherent narrative must have been incredibly challenging, and I don't doubt for a second that you likely encountered many periods of uncertainty and overwhelm in doing so. So again, let me take this opportunity to acknowledge and congratulate you on this accomplishment for establishing the narrative in such a clear and accessible way. Bringing together so many different parts in the way that you do is no small feat. So there were many things that struck me and that I would like to talk about your thesis with you, and hopefully perhaps at some point we'll get a chance to do that further. But for now, I'll just invite you to reflect on a particular aspect that piqued my interest. And this has to do with your role as a mediator of participation, and I guess the role of mediators of participation in general, so the TA professionals, the RI consultants. As Cyrus put it, you were both an insider and an outsider, and I had the feeling sometimes that this insider-outsider role, or the role of these mediators of participation, was sometimes throughout your thesis a little black boxed. Though occasionally you refer to the role of TA as a means for myth-busting, or to TA professionals as either focusing on orchestrating interventions or carrying out analysis, I found myself sort of left wondering what impact these different roles had on the dynamics of opening up and closing down. So I suppose really my interest primarily concerns the question of positionality. And though you make clear a number of lessons that can be learned for doing participation in practice in your conclusion, I wonder if you could take this opportunity today to reflect a little bit more critically on your own role as a mediator of participation in potentially shaping the dynamics of opening up and closing down. So perhaps you can share something about what it means to both intervene and analyze simultaneously, to be both an insider and an outsider, and any lessons you learned along the way of doing that, and maybe things that you might do differently if you were to do this again or in your future research.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for this opportunity to reflect a little bit more on this. In my thesis, my attempt was, or I tried to be equally distant to each of my case study. Apparently, of course, this is difficult. I acknowledge that there is a shift between the focus on the case studies to make sure that my intervention or is not the main thing that I will focus. So in the myth case, that's why the myth case study does not focus on our intervention per se, but why we try to take a step back to look a bit at it a little bit more from the outside. Yeah. In general, I think it's a very, very challenging position to be in, to gather data from people you talk to have discussions, to follow discussions. You, as much as you try to be present in the debates and observe any kind of details that people discuss or non-verbally transmit in any kind of way, there is always something you miss. So you're always selective in the kind of how you engage with people, and in this kind of way, as a person, you of course contribute to a certain selection there. I think what you can do, or what we try to do when we do participation, or when we organize participatory events, is to make sure that there are possibilities, for example, for people to be able to reframe the question at stake, to make it their question, to have the discussions, to ensure that it's not our question that is raised, but theirs to be discussed, for example. That's maybe the first step and the easiest thing to do. Easiest thing in terms of process, maybe not necessarily easiest thing when you do it in the context of research projects that have a certain framing per se. So you have to have there a certain flexibility, a certain scope to be able to shift your own perspective there. What I learn from this is that it's actually that it is interesting, or it gets more and more interesting to see other people, or the outcomes, the results of other people's interventions, to see how they interact, to see where my blind spots are when you're addressing me as a person doing these kinds of things, and to see how you can actually mediate these things in the interaction themselves. I think that's a very, very important point. I think. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition, we now have time for a second round. So the opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Michael Decker.
Dear candidate, it relates a bit to the last question, because in new and emerging technologies, we always need to start with the technology perspective right at the beginning. But at the end of the day, we would like to come up with recommendations, options, solutions. So the problem-oriented approach is the one where you get orientation for policymakers and so on. So with regard to your three cases, in which way was it possible to turn this technology perspective into problem-oriented discussions, so to say, in order to find your way to this orientational aspects there? It's about opening up and closing down again with respect to the normative issues.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question. I think the first one I covered on your enhancement, where we where people try to relate to their own daily experiences, to their work pressure, the pressure at school, and how they cope. So they moved from neuroenhancement to something that helps them to cope with their daily challenges, basically. And there we had interesting insights, but it was nothing about neuroenhancement per se, not in the stricter sense that we required in this project. For synthetic biology, it was the shift from focusing on synthetic biology to wider questions of sustainability, bringing for civil society organizations, for example, bringing in issues of the livelihood of farmers, the question of who would actually gain from this synthetic from fostering synthetic biology as a research field, or from, in one case, from this company who would need the supply on algae in this case. So it was a shift on, or it was a questioning of whether this would actually fit into broader ideas of sustainability, whether it would be a technologically oriented way of innovation or technology oriented way of sustainability, or whether it would be other ideas of sustainability should be involved. In nanotechnology, opening up here was a bit more difficile in terms of, since we already looked at a very closed down setting in terms of this computer software in comparison to the other two, there were certain certain decisions were already made, right? So what to look at, what kinds of factors to factor into, for example, and then the question was of RI professionals in this case, how to introduce other ideas. In this case, it was socioeconomic impact assessment, for example, as an additional module. It is a modular tool that we're talking about here, to ensure that it's not only the scientific part that is being assessed, but you could also, in principle, add other modules if you're interested in doing this in that way. Certain people of this committee in this project then even went further and tried to include ethical assessment, for example, but this was never, as far as I understood from following research, this was never translated into the tool itself, any kind of thing. So it was a bit of, it's a move, but it is a move that requires more effort maybe than just opening up the debate, because there are many different factors, right, in kind of affordances in terms of what kind of what is feasible actually, what is feasible to be translated into indicators to a certain extent in this way or not. But there were attempts to do so in all three cases.
Thank you. We possibly have time, we definitely have time for the question. We'll see how much time we have for the answer. But the opposition will now be continued by Dr. Cornelia Conrad.
Okay, well, then I moved to a second question where I said, which is more addressing what I was a little bit missing being addressed in the thesis. So in section 3.3, in the conceptual part, you have a discussion on the relations between discursive and material elements. And you indicate that in contrast to Andy Sterling, you want to move beyond the purely discursive level of a debate about technologies, and also consider the interrelations with material technologies. However, I have a little bit difficulty in really seeing this. Of course, in this chapter on risk governance, you very nicely, and I find this really a super interesting chapter, definitely, the material role of a modeling tool, but it's the material basis for the debate. Whereas I would like you to reflect a little bit on how you see these opening and closure dynamics roughly at the level of debates around technologies, how these relate to the actual development of material technologies, be they neuro enhancement, synthetic biology, or nanomaterials or nanotechnologies. There has been a lot of work about opening and closure processes, but how do these relate?
Esteemed opponent, thank you. Thank you for this question. You're maybe right that discursive is very much still in my thesis as well. And the relation is not always clear and not always easy to follow to the more material to the more material level. Let's keep it like that. When you, in terms of, I'm trying to decide which example which example to give and how to do this. My attempt was to, or as I understood Andy Sterling, right? It's about the discussion and the social appraisal of technology before any kind of decision is made. So he's in the area of policy advice. He is discussing on how to actually give policy options.
Thank you. Daniela Fuchs, although you were interrupted mid-sentence, the time appointed for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. The mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. Better future than we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
next.
Daniela Fuchs, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee here present has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor van Lente is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Daniela Fuchs, the degree of doctor, and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Closest one. Thank you.
Maybe you approach again?
Yeah, you can come closer.
Yeah, please come a bit closer. Perfect. Please be seated.
Dear Dr. Fuchs, dear Daniela, here we are. It is with such a pleasure that I can address these words to you now. 7 years ago, you asked me in a conference break whether I could act as your supervisor. I remember your presentation about myths in neuroenhancement. It was promising, and that this presentation turned into your current chapter 5 shows that it worked, that you worked. Being an external PhD is hard work. You sometimes visited Maastricht. You followed the summer schools of the Dutch National Research School, and at home in Vienna at the Institute of Technology Assessment, you had to follow the projects the Institute was signing up for. So you had to be flexible and creative. You gave a nice twist to the key question of what engagement is and where it happens. Your research very nicely shows that participation and public engagement in technologies is more than organizing workshops and focus groups. It is more than people sitting together and expressing their views. Public engagement is also about civil society organizations doing their work. And it is also about the way computational modeling is set up. Unlocking participation includes more than expressing ideas. This is an original and important contribution to the search for better public engagement in technology. The three of us, Jori Bruinings, you and me, had regular Zoom meetings. We discussed all kinds of issues about the time you were able to spend on the thesis, about theories you should relate to, academic debates with which you should engage. And whatever the topic, whatever the message, whatever the work it would bring to you, you were always smiling. And you always responded with, okay. This shows how much you're able to accommodate and to make the best of any circumstance. It also shows how smart you are. This combination of accepting what comes to you and making the most of it, with a smile, is a strength of your personality. Because of your ideas and your positive attitude, it's really a joy to work with you. In our collaborations, we experienced some difficulties too, relating to cultural differences, probably. You tended to write with long, twisting sentences, many clauses, dependent clauses, subordinate clauses. It sometimes reminded me of German texts I had to read during my philosophy studies. Long sentences, always a puzzle. You think you got the message, but then at the very end of the sentence you encounter a komma aus. Komma aus? To what verb does that belong? And then the puzzle to reconstruct the message started all over again. So, you remember, we suggested to use the full stop a bit more, instead of commas. In the end, you endorsed the emancipation of the full stop. You also had to adapt to the rules of Dutch university ceremonies. More than with other candidates, we had to tell you what would happen, when, with whom, with which colors, etc. At the very last moment, you asked us whether paronyms were really needed. You asked whether you could do without. No, Daniela, you can't. Fortunately, Yuri used his position in the graduate school to recruit 2 strong men to support you today. Thank you, guys. They say that in science you stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, Daniela, today you did. Daniela, it was really a pleasure to work with you, to have discussions. I already miss our meetings, but that is how it should go. Today you have shown that you are an independent scholar with good ideas, a solid commitment and clever solutions. I trust you will have an inspiring further career. Congratulations.
Well deserved. Well deserved.
Thank you so much. And now we come to a close. Dear Dr. Fuchs, sounds good, huh? Dear Dr. Fuchs, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired. Congratulations, enjoy also with your family. We will now go to the stairs, take a picture with you, and your invited guests can go to the Refta where we will enjoy a reception. So thank you so much and congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.